The chamber was meant to feel solemn, dignified, like the very embodiment of authority. But in a single breath, that illusion cracked. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, wrapped in her black robe and the prestige of the bench, leaned forward with a smirk that was sharper than any gavel. Her voice, calm but dripping with disdain, cut across the room. "Congresswoman, you sound dumb." The word landed like a slap. No elaborate phrasing, no legal jargon, just raw contempt disguised as wit. And for a heartbeat, it seemed as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Heads jerked up. Staffers froze mid-note. A murmur rippled across the chamber, half shock, half disbelief, as if everyone had to check their ears to be sure they heard correctly. Gasps echoed, followed by a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. It was the kind of silence that only comes when arrogance has overplayed its hand, when power shows its ugliest face. The insult was more than a word. It was a message, a warning even. A declaration that intellect, dignity, and belonging could be stripped away with a single syllable from someone who believed she sat untouchable. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes did not widen. Her shoulders did not flinch. If anything, there was a stillness about her, a quiet fire, gathering strength in the face of humiliation. The room expected anger, an outburst, maybe even a stumble. What they did not expect was composure. The kind of composure that speaks louder than rage. You could feel it in the collective breath of the audience. Something was coming. Something they hadn't prepared for. Crockett drew in a measured inhale, her lips parting as though she was pulling words not from the heat of the moment, but from somewhere older, deeper, unshakable. And in that pause, the balance of power shifted. Barrett had delivered her insult like a gavel meant to close the case. But Crockett wasn't closing anything. She was opening a door, one that would turn the very foundation of Barrett's authority against her. What she said next wasn't just a comeback. It wasn't even politics. It was scripture. And when the words finally left her mouth, they would freeze the chamber and silence the judge who thought she could never be humbled. No one expected a sitting judge to be humbled. This way, America was already a nation on edge. Every debate, every headline, every ruling from the high bench carried the weight of culture wars that seemed to stretch back centuries. Questions of race, gender, identity, and belonging weren't just whispered conversations anymore. They were battlegrounds, and in that atmosphere, every word spoken by a figure of authority was magnified, dissected, and replayed as if it were a verdict on who truly belonged in the American story. Judge Amy Coney Barrett had long been cast as the untouchable emblem of that authority. To her admirers, she was the embodiment of intellectual polish, calm, articulate, draped in the quiet confidence of someone who rarely heard the word no. Her robe wasn't just a garment, it was armor. To question her was to question the very weight of the institution she represented. She cultivated the air of someone beyond reproach, above the fray, elevated above the pettiness of ordinary conflict. But beneath that surface, critics saw something else. They saw selective humility, the kind that smiled warmly while dismissing entire communities. They saw a brand of intellect that too often veiled condescension, a habit of wielding faith not as a compass, but as a cudgel. To many, she wasn't just a judge, she was a symbol of how power could clothe itself in civility while cutting deep into the dignity of others. On the opposite side of that divide stood Jasmine Crockett. She was no stranger to fire. Known for her unapologetic style, she had been called passionate, relentless, even brash. But beneath the labels was a deeper truth. Crockett fought not for performance, but for principle. She carried the voices of those too often silenced, and she spoke with the urgency of someone who knew how fragile dignity could be in the wrong hands. Where Barrett leaned on polish, Crockett leaned on grit. Where Barrett radiated untouchability, Crockett embodied accessibility, the stubborn courage of someone rooted in community rather than cloaked in elite power. And so, when Barrett's insult broke through the chamber, it wasn't just one woman belittling another. It was the collision of two Americas, one that believed authority was the final word, and another that believed dignity could never be taken away, no matter how sharp the insult. The stakes were larger than the moment, because this wasn't simply about whether Jasmine Crockett was called dumb. It was about who has the right to define intelligence in America. Is intellect reserved only for those who sit on marble benches and wear robes? Or does it also belong to the voices that rise from neighborhoods, families, and communities that have fought for every inch of recognition? The insult carried centuries of weight, the echo of every time brilliance was dismissed because it came in the wrong accent, from the wrong skin, with the wrong story attached to it. And the silence that followed Barrett's word wasn't just shock, it was recognition. Everyone in that room knew what had just been implied, that power believed it could define truth and belittle dignity with no consequence. But Crockett wasn't about to let the moment pass. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it breathe, let it hang like a question mark over the chamber. And in that stillness, something remarkable began to take shape. Because if Barrett thought she had spoken the final word, she had forgotten one thing. Crockett carried with her not just a voice, but a scripture. And when Barrett tried to belittle her, Crockett reached for something Barrett claimed to know best, the Bible. For years, Judge Coney Barrett was presented as the picture of untouchable respectability. When she first ascended to the national stage, her story was wrapped in carefully polished narratives. The devout Catholic mother of 7, the brilliant legal scholar, the woman who proved that conservative faith and professional success could coexist seamlessly. To her supporters, she was the dream candidate, articulate, poised, and cloaked in the aura of someone who seemed immune to scandal. She wore humility on her sleeve, insisting she was merely an ordinary woman, blessed with extraordinary opportunity. But beneath the veneer of humility, there was always a sharper edge. Her rise was not just about legal skill, it was about the right timing in a political storm. When she was nominated to the Supreme Court, it came in the heat of an election year, a controversial decision that half the nation saw as illegitimate. Her confirmation was celebrated by the right as a triumph of faith and values. But to many others, it was a blunt reminder of raw political maneuvering. The message was clear. Rules could be bent, norms could be broken, if it meant placing someone, like Barrett, in power. And from the bench, she cultivated the same careful duality. She quoted scripture in ways that signaled humility, while simultaneously shaping rulings that critics argued stripped dignity from vulnerable communities. She spoke of the sanctity of life, but often overlooked the lives most affected by the laws she upheld. She projected grace, but wielded her position like a weapon in the culture wars. Her defenders pointed to her intellect. Her critics pointed to her selective morality. Time and again, contradictions surfaced. She claimed to stand for fairness, yet aligned with decisions that eroded voting rights. She spoke of religious liberty, yet those liberties seemed to expand, only for some, narrowing for others. In public interviews, she radiated soft-spoken warmth, yet in the courtroom, she brushed aside arguments that called for empathy and equity, humility on the surface, elitism just beneath. It was a mask that fit too perfectly. For communities who lived on the margins, Barrett wasn't just a judge. She was the face of a system that dressed itself in scripture while denying them a seat at the table. Her interpretation of faith wasn't seen as a guiding light, but as a selectively applied shield, one that defended her ideology while dismissing the humanity of those who didn't fit her mold. To those watching closely, the hypocrisy was glaring. How could someone who professed devotion to scripture so easily weaponize her intellect against those she deemed lesser? And that is why the insult to Jasmine Crockett stung so deeply. It wasn't just a word tossed off in a heated exchange. It was the embodiment of years of condescension, years of dismissing dignity under the guise of superior intellect. When Barrett called Crockett dumb, it carried the weight of every time authority looked down on voices it didn't value. It wasn't just Barrett speaking. It was the institution she represented, the elitism she embodied, the quiet arrogance she rarely let slip in public, but revealed in that moment. Her supporters would defend it as a slip, a rare flash of human frustration. But for millions watching, it was confirmation of what they already knew. Behind the soft smile and polished speeches was a woman who believed her robe made her untouchable, her intellect unquestionable, her power unassailable. And yet, for all her calculation, Barrett had not anticipated that her own weapon, scripture, could be turned against her. In dismissing Crockett, she assumed superiority. In underestimating her, she exposed her own blind spot. Because Crockett didn't just hear the insult, she recognized the hypocrisy behind it. She knew the weight of scripture, not as a talking point, but as a lived truth, and that hypocrisy set the stage for a moment she never saw coming. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat in a chamber across from a Supreme Court justice, she had learned what it meant to be underestimated. She was born into a world where brilliance too often went unnoticed if it wore the wrong face, carried the wrong accent, or came from the wrong side of town. From an early age, she was told the same story countless young black women hear, that she would have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But instead of bending under the weight of those expectations, she sharpened herself against them. Her journey into law was never about prestige. It wasn't about clerking for power or currying favor with the elite. It was about survival and service. Crockett became an attorney because she saw what happened when ordinary people lacked a voice in courtrooms stacked against them. She saw families torn apart, lives destroyed by a system that claimed to be blind, yet seemed to have perfect vision when it came to skin color or class. And so she stepped into that system, not to mimic its elitism, but to challenge it. From her earliest cases, she fought for those society ignored. Tenants pushed out of their homes, workers cheated of their wages, defendants crushed under the weight of unequal justice. These were her clients, her people. Each victory was hard fought, each loss a reminder of how deep the bias ran. But Crockett never learned to back down. If the courtroom demanded a sharper tongue, she found one. If the public eye demanded composure under fire, she practiced it until it became second nature. What others dismissed as stubbornness was, in truth, a shield forged from years of having to prove her worth in spaces that never wanted her there in the first place. And yet, beneath the steel, there was faith. Crockett wasn't a politician who reached for scripture only when it was convenient. She had been raised with the word as a living guide, not a prop. Justice and faith were not separate callings for her. They were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Where some quoted verses for applause, she carried them like anchors. Scripture taught her resilience, dignity, and the radical belief that no insult could strip away the image of God within her. In the halls of Congress, Crockett earned a reputation that fit her history. Fiery, unapologetic, relentless. She did not smooth her edges to fit the mold of what a congresswoman was supposed to look or sound like. She spoke with the cadence of her community, the rhythm of someone who had argued in living rooms and courtrooms alike. And in a political arena built on performance, that authenticity was disarming. Her critics called her abrasive, but her supporters knew better. They saw a woman who carried their struggles with her, who refused to water down truth for the comfort of those in power. Time and again, she reminded America of who she represented. Not the elite, not the privileged, but the people too often shut out of the conversation. She was a mirror to their dignity, their resilience, their worth. And with every insult hurled her way, she grew sharper, stronger, more resolved. For Crockett, insults weren't wounds. They were sparks, reminders of why she had chosen this path in the first place. That is why Barrett's dismissal, that single word, dumb, landed differently for her. Crockett had heard versions of it her entire life. Too loud, too brash, too ambitious, too much. Always too much, and somehow never enough. She knew the script of dismissal by heart, but unlike so many moments in the past, this one didn't leave her searching for a defense. She didn't feel the need to argue her intelligence, her record, her worth. She didn't need to meet arrogance with anger, because what Barrett thought was her greatest weapon, intellect armed with scripture, was a ground Crockett knew better than anyone. The crowd expected an eruption, a fiery rebuttal, maybe even a clash of tempers. But Crockett was carrying something else, something deeper. She had been raised to believe that justice wasn't proven in shouting matches or in the arrogance of titles. It was revealed in the calm certainty of truth. And scripture, for her, wasn't an accessory. It was a compass. So when Barrett called her dumb, Crockett did not hear the final word of authority. She heard an opening. She heard an opportunity to remind not only Barrett but everyone watching that intelligence is not measured in elitism or polished credentials. It is measured in clarity, in courage, in the willingness to speak truth without flinching. And in that moment, she reached for the one thing Barrett never expected her to wield. Not anger, not sarcasm, not even politics. She reached for the word itself, the verses that had shaped her since childhood, the scripture Barrett claimed to stand on but had forgotten how to embody. So when the insult came, she didn't fight fire with fire. She fought it with something far stronger. The moment did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, like a storm inching closer, each interruption adding a new crack of thunder. Barrett had already signaled impatience, cutting across Crockett's sentences with carefully measured sighs and quick dismissals. She leaned forward each time, chin tilted, voice dripping with the kind of calm condescension that pretends to be polite while landing like a blade. To Barrett, it was a display of authority. To Crockett, it was nothing she hadn't seen before. The first interruption came when Crockett began citing precedent. Barrett waved it off with a shake of her head, as if the words themselves were beneath serious consideration. The second came when Crockett tried to frame her argument around lived experience. Barrett's lips curled into something between a smile and a smirk, a look that carried more weight than any phrase. "You don't belong here." And then came the third, the one that would shatter the illusion of civility. Crockett had barely completed her sentence when Barrett leaned into the microphone, her voice slicing through the chamber like glass. "Congresswoman, you sound dumb." The word hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. No legalistic polish, no rhetorical finesse, just naked arrogance, stripped of its usual disguise. It was the kind of insult that revealed more about the speaker than the target, and everyone in the room knew it. The chamber recoiled. Staffers froze mid-scribble. Journalists glanced up from their laptops, unsure whether to type the word as a direct quote or wait for clarification. Gasps broke the silence in scattered bursts, followed by the uneasy murmur of disbelief. Some faces tightened in approval, the smirk of those who enjoyed watching authority flex. Others looked away, discomfort etched across their expressions, as if embarrassed for the institution itself. But at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, still as stone. She did not rush to defend herself. She did not return the insult. She let silence fill the chamber, heavier with each passing second, until it felt less like weakness and more like control. In that silence, Barrett's arrogance began to echo, back on itself. What was meant as a strike instead revealed a fracture. You could feel the divide in the room hardening. On one side, the smug satisfaction of those who saw Crockett's silence as confirmation of Barrett's superiority. On the other, the rising respect of those who recognized composure as the sharpest possible rebuke. Silence, when held with purpose, becomes its own kind of thunder, and Crockett held it masterfully. Her eyes locked forward, calm but alive with something no insult could diminish. Her shoulders stayed square, her expression steady. Every second she refused to flinch was another second the balance of power shifted away from the robe and towards the woman Barrett had tried to belittle. The murmurs swelled into a restless energy, as though everyone in that chamber knew they were standing on the edge of something historic. This was no longer about parliamentary procedure, no longer about legal arguments. It was about dignity. Who owned it? Who could take it? And who could defend it without raising their voice? Barrett leaned back, perhaps expecting her insult to end the conversation. But all it had done was light the fuse. Because silence, as Crockett understood, was not the absence of response. It was the preparation for one. And then Crockett spoke. Her words weren't loud, but they shook the room. For a long suspended moment, silence clung to the chamber like smoke. Barrett's insult was still hanging in the air, sour and sharp, when Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly forward. Her hands folded as if she were holding something sacred. She did not rush, she did not flinch. She simply breathed in, slowly, like a woman who understood that power is not always in the volume of one's voice, but in the weight of one's pause. Her eyes swept the chamber, not defiantly, but steadily, as if she were scanning the faces of those who had gathered, measuring the tremors of arrogance and discomfort in the air. And then, with a voice steady and low, she began. "Judge Barrett," she said, each word deliberate. "There's a verse I was raised on. It goes, 'Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise.'" The words rolled out like a tide, not shouted, not forced, but with a clarity that cut through the silence sharper than any outburst could. The chamber shifted. Eyes widened. Some mouths fell open, in disbelief. The insult that had seconds earlier seemed like the gavel's final strike now looked suddenly small, petty, even childish, when set against the gravity of Scripture. Barrett blinked, her composure faltering just enough for the cameras to catch it. For a woman so accustomed to wielding the Bible as a shield of authority, being confronted with it, turned against her with such precision, was like being stripped of armor. Her smirk vanished, replaced with something tighter, a flicker of surprise, almost fear. The pause after Crockett's words was electric, the kind of pause that feels alive, as though the very walls are listening. And then the ripple began, whispers slicing through the chamber like sparks in dry grass. "Did she just say that?" one voice muttered. "She quoted scripture at Barrett," another whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. The energy in the room shifted, undeniably and irreversibly. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't fired back with anger. Instead, she had summoned something deeper, something Barrett had built her entire reputation on, yet never expected to be wielded against her. It was scripture as thunderclap, and it landed with all the finality of a verdict. Barrett's face told the story of a woman caught off guard in her own arena. She had long cloaked herself in the language of faith, using it to validate her rulings, to sanctify her decisions. Yet now, when the very same words were spoken back to her with integrity and conviction, they exposed her not as the wise authority she claimed to be, but as the hypocrite the verse warned against. She sat frozen, her lips tightening, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as though anchoring herself against a tide she could not control. And Crockett, sensing the shift, did not gloat. She did not lean into mockery or triumph. She simply let the verse breathe in the room, allowing its echo to do the work. She looked calm, almost serene, as though she knew the words weren't hers alone. They belonged to everyone who had ever been belittled, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. For the audience, the moment was transformative. To see Barrett silenced not by fury but by faith was like watching a statue crack. Every camera caught it, every microphone recorded it, and within minutes the clip would be replayed online, shared with captions like, "Crockett just turned the Bible on Barrett," and "When scripture silences arrogance." On social media, reactions would pour in. Admiration, disbelief, validation. People would type out the verse, post it alongside the still frame of Barrett's frozen face, and declare it the line of the year. But in the chamber itself, the drama unfolded in real time. Barrett tried to recover, her lips parting as though to form a response. Yet nothing came. Every attempt at a rebuttal seemed trapped in her throat, suffocated by the irony of her own reputation. The more she shifted in her chair, the more the silence around her grew oppressive, as though the very institution she had wielded now turned its gaze back on her. Meanwhile, Crockett's stillness grew more powerful. She had delivered her verse and sat back, her expression unreadable yet dignified, as if to say, "The point has been made. No further words are needed." It was the restraint that amplified the blow, the refusal to add anything beyond what Scripture itself had already spoken. The contrast could not have been sharper. Barrett, the polished judge, the intellectual cloaked in robes, suddenly looked small, rattled, exposed. Crockett, the congresswoman so often underestimated, radiated the quiet authority of someone who knew truth didn't need embellishment. It was a reversal so complete, so cinematic, that those present would later describe it in hushed tones as if they had witnessed not just a debate, but a reckoning. Because in that instant, the hierarchy of power inverted. The robe lost its sanctity, the insult lost its sting, and the woman called dumb became the embodiment of wisdom itself. And yet, Crockett's verse did more than silence Barrett. It spoke to a larger audience, to every person watching, who had ever been told they were less than, who had been mocked for their intelligence, their background, their faith. It was validation woven into scripture, a reminder that arrogance cloaked in power is still arrogance, and that wisdom often wears the face of those dismissed as fools. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Barrett's frozen expression, the awkward shuffle of aides behind her, the unmistakable shift of momentum in Crockett's favor. It was the kind of moment destined for replay, destined for virality, destined to become more than just a headline. It would become a cultural reference point, because what Crockett had done was more than a rebuttal. It was an unmasking. A single verse had peeled back years of polished image, exposing hypocrisy at its core, and it had been delivered not with fury, but with faith, not with arrogance, but with dignity. Barrett sat still, unable to reclaim the room. Crockett, by saying less, had said more than any outburst ever could. And as the echoes of scripture lingered, everyone watching knew the balance of power had shifted, but the impact didn't stop in that room. The clip spread like fire on dry grass. Within minutes, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram were flooded. With the moment, Jasmine Crockett leaning forward, speaking scripture with quiet authority, and Coney Barrett frozen in disbelief. By nightfall, the hashtag #BibleVsBarrett was trending across platforms, not just in the US, but internationally. Memes sprouted instantly. Barrett cast as the Goliath figure, stiff and towering, only to be toppled by Crockett's David-like slingshot of words. TikTok creators remixed the clip, slowing down Crockett's delivery, adding dramatic music, inserting captions like "Wisdom over arrogance" or "When scripture humbles power." What began as a tense exchange inside a chamber had transformed into a cultural moment outside it. A battle not of laws or rulings, but of values. Commentators from across the political spectrum jumped in. On progressive networks, anchors replayed the verse again and again, marveling at its precision, its elegance, its force. On conservative outlets, the tone was more defensive, some commentators accusing Crockett of grandstanding, while others awkwardly sidestepped the substance of the moment entirely. But the people watching knew better. They didn't just see words, they saw a reckoning. It was quickly framed as a modern-day David and Goliath, scripture edition. Crockett, the fiery congresswoman often underestimated, had brought down not just a judge, but the aura of untouchable superiority that surrounded her. And in doing so, Crockett had turned what could have been just another viral clash into something resembling a parable. Faith leaders took notice too. Churches across the country, from small immigrant congregations to large urban pulpits, began referencing the exchange. Some pastors applauded Crockett for embodying scripture rather than wielding it as a weapon. "She lived the word," one minister said on Sunday morning, his sermon going viral on YouTube. "She didn't use it to dominate. She used it to reveal truth. That is what scripture is meant for." Even among religious moderates and disillusioned believers, the moment struck a chord. Many had grown weary of seeing faith reduced to political theatre, weaponized as a talking point rather than practiced as a moral compass. Crockett's calm, grounded invocation of scripture felt different, authentic, rooted in lived experience, not staged performance. It was the contrast that resonated. Barrett cloaked in elitism, undone by her own chosen language. Crockett, grounded in dignity, lifting scripture not as a shield, but as a mirror. And so the ripple effect began. Crockett's stature rose almost overnight. Commentators described her not only as a political fighter, but as a moral voice, someone who could channel both justice and faith in a way that cut through division. Clips of her past speeches resurfaced, reframed as evidence of a woman who had been underestimated for too long. Supporters flooded her social media with messages. "You spoke for all of us. That moment was history. Finally, someone showed that dignity can defeat arrogance." Meanwhile, Barrett's credibility began to falter. For years, she had cultivated an image of intellect fused with faith, a figure above reproach, untouchable in her authority. But now, that very image had been cracked. Commentators asked uncomfortable questions. If she could be so easily humbled by a single verse, what did that say about her command of the principles she claimed to represent? Editorials appeared in newspapers, not questioning her legal qualifications, but her authenticity. "Barrett built her house on scripture," one columnist wrote, "but tonight we saw the cracks in the foundation." The debate was no longer just about one insult or one rebuttal. It had become a referendum on who gets to define American intelligence, American morality, American truth. Was it the polished, elite figure who used faith as a banner? Or was it the unapologetically authentic voice who lived that faith as resilience, as justice, as dignity? In living rooms and cafes, in WhatsApp groups and Facebook comment sections, ordinary people debated not just the moment but its meaning. For some, it was a turning point, a reminder that arrogance dressed in robes is still arrogance, and that wisdom often rises from those dismissed or belittled. For others, it was validation, proof that the old hierarchies of power can be challenged, even shattered by truth spoken plainly. But as the frenzy grew, one truth became clear. This was bigger than Barrett, bigger than Crockett. It was about us, about what we choose to believe in when the performance of faith collides with the practice of it, about whether we will side with the symbols of power or with the substance of dignity, about whether America's future will belong to those who cling to elitist definitions of intelligence, or to those who redefine wisdom as courage, authenticity, and truth. And yet, the real story wasn't just about Barrett. It was about us and what we choose to believe in. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. The exchange that began with a single word, dumb, transformed into a lesson replayed across the country. What could have been remembered as just another insult in the endless cycle of political theatre, instead became a moment of moral clarity. Crockett's response did not rise to the level of Barrett's arrogance. It surpassed it, transcending insult with scripture, elevating a clash into a parable. Because here was the truth laid bare. Arrogance may shout, but dignity whispers louder. And in that chamber, surrounded by cameras, headlines, and centuries of power, it was the whisper that endured. Crockett reframed what had been meant as an attack into something far larger, something almost universal. She reminded America that scripture, so often used as a weapon in the culture wars, was never meant to belittle or divide. Its essence, its heartbeat, has always been about lifting others up, grounding them in compassion, reminding them of their worth. Barrett may have tried to claim the mantle of faith, but Crockett revealed what faith truly looks like. Not performance, not condescension, but the unshakable belief that dignity belongs to everyone. That was the moral pivot. Barrett had the robe, the title, the platform. Crockett had something greater, authenticity. And authenticity, when spoken with clarity, always pierces through performance. The contrast could not have been starker. One voice trying to diminish, the other choosing to elevate. One built on elitism, the other grounded in lived truth. This was more than a debate. It was the timeless contest of values, dignity against arrogance, authenticity against performance, truth against titles. And in that contest, Crockett showed what so many yearn to see, that the values of justice and equality are not fragile ideals, but unbreakable foundations. The emotional crescendo resounded far beyond the chamber. For immigrants who had been told they didn't belong, Crockett's words felt like a shield. For women dismissed as less intelligent, her calm rebuttal was validation. For communities of faith disillusioned by hypocrisy, it was a reminder that Scripture could still be a source of light rather than a tool of control. She didn't just speak to Barrett. She spoke to everyone who has ever been belittled, underestimated, or told their intelligence didn't count. She spoke to the child who raises their hand in class only to be mocked. She spoke to the worker dismissed by a boss who confuses power with wisdom. She spoke to the millions who understand that respect is not given by titles, but earned by truth. And that is why the moment mattered. It wasn't just Crockett versus Barrett. It wasn't just a clash of two women from different worlds. It was a mirror held up to the country. A reminder that what we choose to value shapes who we become. If we reward arrogance, then arrogance will reign. If we honor dignity, then dignity will endure. And in that chamber, in that fleeting silence, after the scripture was spoken, the choice became visible to all. The lesson was not complicated, but it was profound. Power can silence, but only for a moment. Truth echoes longer. Titles can command attention, but authenticity commands respect. Performances can win applause, but only integrity can win hearts. That is the legacy of what Crockett did. Not just a rebuttal, not just a viral clip, but a parable for our time. Proof that dignity is stronger than insult. That scripture belongs not to the powerful, but to those who live it. And that America's truest strength lies not in arrogance, but in humility, justice, and truth. And so, when people replayed that clip, they didn't just see a comeback, they saw a lesson, a reminder, a call. Because this wasn't just Crockett versus Barrett, it was a lesson for all of us. Barrett called her dumb, but Crockett's scripture left America speechless. What began as an insult meant to demean became a defining moment, a reminder that truth always humbles arrogance. One verse, spoken with calm and conviction, carried more weight than all the titles, robes, and power assembled in that chamber. That is why this story matters. It wasn't just about a single exchange between two women. It was about what we as a country choose to honor. Do we reward arrogance dressed up as intellect? Or do we stand with dignity, humility, and authenticity when they shine through? Jasmine Crockett reminded us that real power doesn't come from belittling others. Real power comes from lifting the truth higher than the noise, and that is where you come in. If this moment struck you, if it reminded you of the strength of resilience, the beauty of authenticity, and the unshakable force of truth, then don't let it fade into another headline. Be part of the movement that refuses to let arrogance define our future. Subscribe, share this story, and join a community of truth-tellers who believe in something greater than titles. The belief that dignity belongs to all of us, because sometimes one verse can silence 1,000 lies. And when that verse is spoken with courage, it doesn't just humble arrogance in a single room. It reverberates across the nation. So let this be more than a story you watched. Let it be a reminder you carry. That when arrogance shouts, we answer with dignity. When falsehoods spread, we answer with truth. And when someone tries to diminish us, we rise not with louder voices, but with stronger values.